Hello, it's my Cambridge presentation. My ID is 0379. The presentation is about the unequal compensation of legal migrant workers. These will touch on the political aspects of this ongoing dilemma. Now, my group. The group problem is migrant workers receiving inequitable compensation for their labor. They are exploited by giving cheap labor, making it hard for them to make a living. My lens is political, which concerning this project is the government involvement of these migrant wages. Cultural and Social is presented by Gabriel Adams, the Economic is Evan Searby, and Anthony Sanchez is presenting the Ethical. Next is the specific problem of this presentation. The problem is migrant workers receive low pay for the work they put out. Migrants internationally receive less pay doing the same job as others or put lower wage jobs that would normally pay higher salaries. Many countries have a lack of policies that help with this gap in their states, whilst others do but have the policies but not enforce them. It's very hard for migrant workers to find and keep their jobs. Migrant wage problem is an international dilemma which can be seen all around the world. Few problems are modern slavery, wages versus local workers, child workers being exploited. Modern slavery is a huge problem internationally. Many migrant workers are put into slavery to perform forced labor. According to the International Labor Association, 10,548 to 22,198 of underpayment forced labor is forced per person in different regions such as the Middle East, North Africa, transition economies, and some parts of Asia. A more modern system in place called kafala system, which is used by Middle Eastern governments. This system promises work to help bring money for workers' families, but they aren't told the destination, which is most commonly Jordan, Lebanon, most of the Arab Gulf. This system is supported by the Middle Eastern governments because most of their policies are extremely harsh towards non-citizens of their countries. Wage competition is high with migrant workers against local workers, which leads to a depression of migrant wages compared to their local worker counterparts. Migrants will make 13% less than national workers, can be up to 42% in other countries. Children will migrate due to several reasons: economic, cultural, social, emergencies, or personal push factors. Migrant children around the world face wage exploitation by forced labor and being manipulated because of children. Migrating without their parents leaves them vulnerable to forced labor or even low-wage jobs. Even with adults, they're still vulnerable due to harm due to unsafe working agencies. Many governments will not step in, and if they do, they'll treat them like illegal immigrants and they'll be deported. The International Labor Association will say migrant children will earn less than local workers, even if they work longer hours. In the International Convention of Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, 56 of 206 recognized states passed the treaty. Although few states have other policies similar to this treaty, many do not, which allows for the employers and states to have their way with migrant workers. This can cause wage disparities for migrant workers because they have no rights in the states they work in. The Gini coefficient is by definition a statistical measure of the inequality represented in a state in a wage gap. The graph represents the Gini coefficient for migrant workers in different countries. The closer to 45%, the more the gap there is. So this shows that migrant workers have a major pay gap in some of these countries. Although some countries do not have the gap with their migrant workers, which is shown as the negative mean gaps. This graph shows the modern slave count around the world. Note, not all of them are migrant workers, but a good majority are, according to the International Labor Association. But what is this supposed to mean? Modern slaves has a loose definition today because it comes in many forms. For this situation, someone who has withheld compensation, promised, or given very little compensation. On this graph, there are 16 million modern slaves, workers, which many migrant workers are a part of. They are withheld compensation for the labor, and the situation forces them to keep working. Of the 4.8 million state-imposed laborers in states that have used the kafala system, many migrant workers are imposed by that system in the Middle East. The last 4.1 million people into sexual labor, which has many migrant workers being forced into horrendous lives of work for little to no pay. Now, the local problem of migrant workers in Florida. The H-2A worker government program is to help local farm workers from being undermined by employers. Many migrant workers are a part of this program to help them, yet H-2A workers are severely underpaid and cannot ask for more money or they'll not be able to return to work. The program makes it to where employers picks who they want to come back to the country to work because the workers return to their country after they're done working. In Florida, use of the H-2A can be very restricting from employers, which affects their payment. This is because employers have the right to withhold payments from migrant workers, and they don't have many options other than this program. Many visa holders have to pay expensive traveling fees and are paid bribes for jobs and visas. There are also 3 other programs that visa holders can go to, but 2 of them tie the worker to an employer, and the third is tied to a sponsor, which means the sponsor and employer have to control over the workers' payments. Policies in Florida are allowing underpayment of migrant workers. Agricultural policies such as the H2A J1 or A3/G5, according to the Polaris data of 2018-2019, 72% of migrant workers were victims or a part of these policies-made programs. Many of the victims of wage theft and low compensation. Do you know not all 72% in Florida, but it is shown here locally due to many migrant workers in Florida having an H2A and H2B. These policies are made with the intent to help these workers, yet they're still being exploited. Local governments choose to ignore the migrant workers. That disregard of the workers makes the government part of the problem. This graph represents the legal status of farm workers from 1991 to 2020, showing the graph of migrant workers making up a good percentage of farm workers. The H2A workers are some of the lowest paid workers in the U.S. labor force. Some of the biggest H2A states are Georgia and Florida, having considerably low wages to the other H2A states. Migrant workers make up a good amount of the H2A workforce, even outside of Florida, but most of them are in Florida. The solution. The group solution is for the International Labor Association to create state-specific labor laws for each country because they are different from each other. Using a social influence, governments can be pressured by their people to enforce and create laws that help shorten the gap between incomes. Solution that can help is to internationalize the rights treaties, specifically the Migrant Employment Convention that helps migrant workers make more bills like this, help popularize the ratification of similar treaties. Sanctions will force countries into making decisions or facing economic hardships. I think this is a great idea to force countries to finally follow regulations and help migrant workers. The only downside to this solution is that it can cause relationships between countries to be strained, so there would have to be a specific sanction so it doesn't destroy their economies but forces their decision. Examples: when 2019 American issued a withhold release order to Malaysian glove companies that, in quote, the Malaysian Rubber Glove Manufacturers Association, which represents the sector, so the companies have committed at least $61 million to an effort in all address to address the U.S. forced labor claims, according to the VOA News, which shows the effective the sanctions are. Looking into the past can be also very helpful. It shows the solutions to prevalent problems. Unknown factors to the wage gap can be found by looking through history. Finding these unknown factors, according to the International Labor Association, will create favorable situations for migrant workers in some countries. These are all the sources I used to fact check and make this presentation. Thank you for listening to my presentation about the exploitation of migrant workers' wages.